In this screencast, you will be introduced to the brain and you will learn about the cerebrum. These topics are covered in Chapter 7 of your textbook. This screencast was designed to help you achieve the following objectives. List the 4 regions of the brain. Describe the basic functional anatomy of the cerebrum. Define white and gray matter. List the cognitive functions for which the cerebrum is mainly responsible. Describe the general function of sensory, motor, and association areas of the cerebrum. Describe the function of the somatosensory area or cortex. And finally, describe the function of the primary motor cortex. This slide is going to very briefly illustrate how the central nervous system develops during the first 22 days of embryonic development. I am not going to hold you responsible for this information on an exam or quiz. It is simply to help you understand the basic anatomy of the central nervous system. So shortly after fertilization, we have a neural plate. This is the tissue layer that will eventually become the central nervous system. It is shown in green, both in the superior view of the embryo as well as this frontal view of the embryo. Eventually, that neural plate will invaginate or form a concave surface, which is called the neural groove. It will continue to invaginate, eventually forming a neural tube enclosing a space. And that neural tube will become the brain and spinal cord, and the enclosed space will become the ventricles of the brain and the central canal of the spinal cord, and will contain cerebral spinal fluid. The brain is divided into 4 regions, starting first with the most superior region. They are the cerebrum, which is divided into 2 cerebral hemispheres, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and finally the cerebellum. First, let's discuss the cerebrum. The cerebrum includes more than half of the total mass of the brain. In this figure here, everything that you see in color is part of the cerebrum. The cerebrum is divided into a right and left cerebral hemisphere by this deep groove called the longitudinal fissure. To increase surface area, the surface of the cerebrum is thrown into folds called gyri or gyrus singular, and grooves called sulci or sulcus singular. A very important sulcus that you will use as a landmark as you study the functional anatomy of the brain is the central sulcus. The central sulcus is located centrally on the cerebrum, looking front to back, and you will learn that it separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobes. 2 other important landmarks will include the gyrus that is just anterior to the central sulcus, called the precentral gyrus, and the gyrus that is directly posterior to the central sulcus, called the postcentral gyrus. Pre means before, post means after, so the precentral gyrus is the gyrus that is anterior or before the central sulcus, and the postcentral gyrus, of course, is the gyrus that is after or posterior to the central sulcus. Each cerebral hemisphere is divided into 4 lobes, so that's 8 lobes total. There are 2 frontal lobes, 2 parietal lobes, 2 occipital lobes, and 2 temporal lobes. These lobes are named after the cranial bones that lie over them. If you were to dissect the cerebrum, you would find that the outer layer, called the cerebral cortex — cortex means bark, like the outer portion of a tree, the cerebral cortex is composed of gray matter, and this is because that's where the neuron cell bodies are located. Deep to the cerebral cortex is the white matter. The white matter consists of myelinated axons bundled together into fiber tracts, which descend from the neuron cell bodies of the cerebral cortex. This is a frontal view of the brain and spinal cord on the right, and a neuron shown on the left. Again, the cerebral cortex is composed of neuron cell bodies organized into nuclei. Remember, nuclei are just clusters of cell bodies. And then deep to the cerebral cortex, we have the white matter, and the white matter consists of myelinated axons. One very prominent mass of white matter is the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum consists of fiber tracts which allow the right and left hemispheres to communicate with one another. The cerebrum is responsible for many cognitive functions. You can think of a cognitive function as requiring the learning of information, the storage of information, and the recall of that information, such as the case with speech and memory. Speech is a very complicated ability. Many animals can communicate with other animals. For example, an animal can make a sound that is interpreted as an alarm by other animals, but that's not speech. Humans are one of the few animals that actually have a complicated speech. We can write, we can read, and we can speak very complicated messages to one another. This is something that is unique to humans, and again requires the learning, storage, and recall of information, and therefore is a cognitive skill. Memory is another cognitive skill or ability that's housed in the cerebrum. Logical and emotional responses or other cognitive functions that are housed in the cerebrum. Consciousness, which is our ability to be aware of the world around us as well as our place in that world. That function of consciousness is also housed in the cerebrum. And lastly, interpretation of sensation, the ability to determine if something is hot or cold or an itch or pain. That ability is also found in the cerebrum. And finally, voluntary movement, while not exclusively found in the cerebrum is responsible for the initiation of voluntary movement. To accomplish these functions, the cerebral cortex has three main types of areas that perform a special type of activity. Sensory areas receive nerve impulses from the body's sensory receptors. Motor areas send impulses to skeletal muscles for movement. And association areas integrate information from other areas of the brain, including other areas of the cerebrum, as well as the cerebellum, diencephalon, and brainstem. I want to now look at a few of these specialized areas of the cerebral cortex. I want to use as a point of reference the central sulcus. Recall that the central sulcus is that groove that separates the frontal lobes from the parietal lobes. Located just posterior to the central sulcus is the postcentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus is also called the somatic sensory area or primary sensory cortex. It is responsible for receiving impulses from sensory receptors throughout the body, and here it interprets those sensory receptors, allowing you to recognize pain or an itch or pressure or hot and cold or simply a light touch. This figure from your book illustrates the pathway by which sensory impulses are sent from sensory receptors in the skin to the somatosensory area. Let's say you were to touch a cat with your right hand. Sensory receptors would send sensory impulses into the spinal cord. From there, they would move up the spinal cord, eventually crossing over in the brainstem, the medulla oblongata in this particular case, and then the sensory receptors would be sent to a specific location in the somatosensory area that receives sensory impulses from the hand. Notice that sensory receptors on one side of the body send sensory impulses to the somatosensory area in the opposite side of the brain. In this case, the sensory receptors are located in the right hand. The portion of the somatosensory area that receives those impulses is located in the left side of the brain. This figure shows the somatosensory area for one side of the cerebral cortex. Notice two things. One, specific parts of the somatosensory area receive sensory input from specific parts of the body. Also notice that some areas of the body have large proportions of the somatosensory area that are responsible for interpreting sensory input, while others have a relatively small proportion interpreting sensory input. This reflects the fact that some parts of the body are more sensitive than others. Parts of the body that are very sensitive have a high density of sensory receptors, and therefore a disproportionately large proportion of the somatosensory area interpreting sensation from that portion of the body. Those parts of the body that are less sensitive have a low density of sensory receptors and a disproportionately low proportion of the somatosensory area that interpret sensation or sensory input from that portion of the body. For example, let's look at the face. Your face represents about 4.5% of the total surface area of your body. Yet look at the proportion of the somatosensory area that's responsible for interpreting sensation or sensory input from that small 4.5% of the surface area of the body. Contrast that with the body trunk. Your body trunk, the anterior and posterior surface, represent about 36% of the total surface area of your body. However, the trunk is not very sensitive, doesn't have a large density of sensory receptors, and therefore a relatively small proportion of the somatosensory area is responsible for interpreting sensory receptors from that portion of the body. I do want to take a moment to note that the areas of the brain responsible for our special senses are all in the cerebral cortex. I will not require you to identify or even name any of these areas. I simply want you to know that our ability to taste, our ability to see, hearing and balance, as well as to smell, are all the responsibility of nuclei in the cerebral cortex. I now want to look at a specialized motor area of the cerebral cortex, again using the central sulcus as our landmark or point of reference. The gyrus just anterior to the central sulcus is the precentral gyrus, also called the primary motor area. This portion of the cerebral cortex is responsible for sending motor output to our skeletal muscles, which allows us to consciously move our body parts. In other words, the neurons located in the primary motor area are responsible for voluntary movement. This figure from your book illustrates the motor pathway by which motor impulses would travel in order to allow you to touch a cat with your right hand. So in the primary motor cortex in the left hemisphere, motor impulses would be sent down the brain, down the spinal cord. They cross over to the opposite side of the spinal cord and then out to muscles of the right hand. Again, notice that the primary motor cortex in the left cerebral hemisphere is responsible for movement of skeletal muscles on the right side of the body. This figure shows the primary motor cortex for one side of the brain. Notice two things. Specific parts of the primary motor cortex send motor output to specific parts of the body, number one. And two, some areas of the body are served by large proportions of the primary motor cortex, while others receive motor output from relatively small portions of the primary motor cortex. This reflects the fact that some parts of the body have very fine motor control, while other parts of the body have more coarse motor control. In the face, you have large numbers of small muscles for fine motor control, necessary for facial expression. Thus, a large proportion of the primary motor cortex is responsible for controlling the muscles of the face. In the body trunk, in contrast, you have fewer numbers but very large muscles and very coarse movements. So you don't need as many neurons in the primary motor cortex controlling the muscles of the body trunk. One motor area that I should mention would be the basal nuclei. So most of the gray matter of the cerebrum is located in the cerebral cortex. However, we do have little islands of nuclei located deep in the cerebrum, and one is the basal nuclei. Now, there's a lot about the basal nuclei that we do not know or understand. However, we do know that it does have some influence on voluntary muscle movement. I would also want to note at this time that there are many other regions of the brain that we will discuss later that are involved in the planning, the sequencing, and the execution of body movements. So the cerebrum does not exercise full control of voluntary muscle movement. Yes, the cerebrum is responsible for initiating voluntary muscle movement, but other regions of the brain can influence that movement. I do want to point out one specific motor area, and that is the Broca's area. The Broca's area, which is located on the frontal lobe, is responsible for controlling muscles that are involved in speech. An individual who has damage to the Broca's area can think about what they want to say, but they have problems physically pronouncing the words. This is also called motor aphasia or Broca's aphasia. Now that we've talked about sensory and motor areas, let's talk a little bit about association areas. So if you recall, we said association areas integrate information from several parts of the brain, and this allows for perception. In other words, it allows one to make sense of the sensory input. So a sensory area allows you to hear something, to taste something, to feel something. But it is the association area that makes sense of that sensory input. So the sensory area allows you to hear a sound, but the association area allows you to identify that sound as your mother's voice or a specific song. The sensory area might allow you to see someone's face. However, it is the association area that allows you to recognize a friend's face or your mother's face or your instructor's face. On the motor output side of things, the association areas are responsible for constructing a plan or sequence of movements which are then used to direct the motor areas to move specific muscles at specific times. Let's review the objectives of the screencast. List the 4 regions of the brain. Describe the basic functional anatomy of the cerebrum. Define white and gray matter. List the cognitive functions for which the cerebrum is mainly responsible. Describe the general function of sensory, motor, and association areas of the cerebrum. Describe the function of the somatosensory area or cortex. And finally, describe the function of the primary motor cortex. The next screencast discusses the diencephalon.